NFL teams were mad. The World Football League was signing some of their best players in 1974, and there was excitement being generated. The Dolphins were the team hit the hardest by the WFL player raid. Larry Zonka, Jim Kick, and Paul Warfield all signed futures contracts to play for the Memphis Southmen for their 1975 season. Zonka had just completed his third straight 1,000 rushing yard season in 1973, as well as making the Pro Bowl for the fourth straight year and All-Pro for the third time. Although Jim Kick was named to the Pro Bowl in 1968 and 1969, he only rushed for 257 yards in 1973 and appeared to be wearing down. Wide receiver Paul Warfield, however, made his sixth straight Pro Bowl in 1973 and his third straight All-Pro season. Quarterback Danny White was the Dallas Cowboys' third-round draft pick in 1974 out of Arizona State, but he signed with the Southmen instead. Lucius Selman was a second-team All-American defensive lineman out of Oklahoma in 1972 and made unanimous first-team All-American status in 1973. He was the oldest of the three Salmon brothers who all started together on Oklahoma's defensive line. Birmingham Americans hit it big with some key signings too. They planned to fill Legion Field with local product Ken Stabler, who was born in Foley, Alabama, and played for Paul Bear Bryant at Alabama. The Americans signed him to a futures contract for the 1976 season. Just think if the World Football League had been successful and stayed operable through the 1976 season. Ken Stabler wouldn't have been the Raiders' starting quarterback, Darryl LaMonica wouldn't have been in Oakland either, and old man George Blanda was retired by then. The Raiders won their Super Bowl for the 1976 season, but it's highly doubtful that they do if the World Football League is successful. Birmingham signed quarterback George Myra to play until Stabler arrived. He had last played for Miami in 1971 and had only started 8 games in 7 NFL seasons. Running back Charlie Haraway was an excellent complement to backfield mate Larry Brown, but he had played 8 NFL years and was getting long in the tooth at age 30 in 1974. Wide receiver Ron Jesse was a legitimate deep threat that was signed to a futures contract for the 1975 season. The Hawaiians played their home games at Honolulu Stadium in 1974, and they moved to Aloha Stadium in 1975. They signed Vikings wide receiver John Gilliam during the prime of his career to a 1975 futures contract. He never played for the Hawaiians, however. Instead, he played for the Chicago Winds in 1975 until they folded after 5 regular season games. He returned to play for the Vikings just in time for the start of their regular season, so he played 19 regular season games in 1975. The Hawaiians also signed 6'4", 230-pound running back Calvin Hill to a 1975 futures contract. He was a 5-year veteran who had won the 1969 Offensive Rookie of the Year award, but he only played 3 games and scored 1 touchdown in 1975. Ted Kowalik was a Pro Bowl tight end from 1971 through 1973 when he caught 52, 40, and 47 passes. Huge numbers for a tight end back then. Quarterback Randy Johnson started 11 games for the 1966 expansion Falcons, but he was age 30 in 1974 after he played with the Giants from 1971 through 1973. The Houston Texans called the eighth wonder of the world, the Astrodome, their home, and they made a big splash by signing Cowboys quarterback Craig Morton to a 1975 futures contract. Perhaps hoping to drum up some interest from nearby Louisiana, the Texans signed what I call the French Connection. Running back Hoyle Grandjet last played in 1972 and only rushed for a total of 125 yards during his last 3 NFL seasons. Chuck LaTourette was a jack-of-all-trades of sort, as he punted, played defensive back, and returned punts and kicks. He excelled in the return game, which allowed him to lead the NFL in all-purpose yards in 1968 with 1,597. Garland Boyette was a former Pro Bowl player, but he last played in 1972 and was age 34 in 1974. The Florida Blazers had an odd helmet logo, and they played their home games at the Tangerine Bowl in Orlando. They signed wide receiver Gary Collins despite his last NFL season being in 1971. He had 70 career receiving touchdowns, but he was age 34 in 1974 and he was finished. Bill Berge was a huge 6'4", 245-pound middle linebacker who was the 1969 Defensive Rookie of the Year. Known for hitting like a Mack truck, he was also a very agile pass defender. Jacksonville Sharks had a cool helmet logo and played their home games at the 70,000-seat Gator Bowl. They signed quarterback John Stofa, nicknamed the original Bingle, because he started 7 games for the 1968 expansion Bengals. He had last played for the 1970 Dolphins when he threw 53 passes. He was age 32 in 1974 and was toast. The Sharks signed players with some peculiar names. The Southern California Sun called Anaheim Stadium home, and they had a couple of big signings. Even though quarterback Darryl LaMonica lost his starting job to Ken Stabler during the 1973 season, he had been a Pro Bowl player as recently as 1972, and he was a 2-time AFL Player of the Year award winner. He signed a 1975 futures contract. The Sun also signed Big Bad Curly Culp to a 1975 futures contract. The New York Stars signed old New York players and played in quaint Downing Stadium that only held 27,000 fans. Wide receiver Homer Jones was a Pro Bowl player in 1967 and 1968, but he last played for the Browns in 1970 when he only caught 10 passes. He was 33 years old in 1974, and this signing made no sense, even though at one time he was a major big play receiver. Wide receiver George Sauer was another former Star signing that made no sense, as he last played in 1970. Prior to that, he was an outstanding receiver. The Stars signed past Jets players defensive end Gary Philbin and defensive tackle John Elliott, but they were both well past their prime years. The Chicago Fire had a handful of signings that they hoped to help pack Soldier Field. They hoped that quarterback Virgil Carter, who last played for Cincinnati in 1972, would return to form when he led the NFL with a 62.2 completion percentage in 1971. Rudy Kuchenberg was a strange signing because he last played in 1971 for Atlanta and had only started 10 games in 5 NFL seasons. His brother Bob had a far more successful career. The Fire signed tackle Bob McKay to a 1975 futures contract. The Detroit Wheels had a unique helmet logo, and they played their home games at tiny Rynearson Stadium that only held 24,000 patrons. The Wheels signed the Flea, Warren McVay, who did not play in 1972 and only rushed 4 times in 1973. Prior to those seasons, he was a fast, shifty runner. Portland Storm's general manager was future Hall of Famer Ron Mix, and he had a couple of questionable signings. Wide receiver Gail Cogdill was age 37 in 1974, and he last played for Atlanta in 1970. Defensive tackle Ron Billingsley was a huge man at 6'8", 290 pounds, but he last played for the Oilers in 1972. The team that made the smallest signing splash was the Philadelphia Bell, who played at the expansive John F. Kennedy Stadium, which held 90,000 fans. Canadian Football Leaguers Rudy Sims and Wally Dempsey were supposed to aid the defense, while wide receiver Lindsey Cole was to be a scoring threat, although he only caught 35 passes in 3 NFL seasons from 1970 through 1972.